Thank you, everybody. So thanks for joining us for our first session, Neglected Regions. I'm Carly McKay, the Projects Manager at Faunalytics, and I'm really excited to introduce the next set of speakers. First up is Yao, the China Research Manager for Compassion in World Farming. She will share her insights on the progress and challenges of farmed animal welfare in China, highlighting its global implications and offering strategies for more effective science-based advocacy.
Hi, my name is Yao, and I'm the China Research Manager at Compassion in World Farming. It is my pleasure and honor to be here today at the Fauna Connections Remote Symposium and deliver this presentation on better lives for farm animals in China, why it matters to the world. First, I would like to explain why China matters in terms of statistics. China is the world's largest meat producer and consumer. According to the FAO, China accounts for 27% of the global meat consumption. This is a map of China. It is in the shape of a rooster. The darker green areas represent the 4 core pasture-based provinces or regions in China. They're largely located in northern China, where the weather is colder, the vegetation is ample, and population less dense. Please bear this rooster and its dark green wings and rear in mind, because this will be relevant when we discuss the development of intensive farming in China. According to the FAO, China ranks number 2 in meat chicken production, number 1 in pig production, and number 3 in cattle. This is complementary to our opening sentence about the scale of things. But I always like to include the numbers from MARA, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs of China, because it tells us, if not exactly, but the number of animals instead of the number of tons. In 2024, there were over 70 million pigs slaughtered, 50 million cattle, 32 million sheep, and over 17 billion birds. Now, I hope this is clear because somehow this gives the public and us a sense of individuality for these animals. We don't do this with people, don't we? We say 10 people showed up for this meeting, not 700 kilograms of human beings. We are focusing on farmed animals today, but they never exist in isolation, especially when it comes to the law and policy. Unfortunately, there is currently no official animal welfare law in China. However, in the last 12 years, there are many campaigns and proposals handed to the government. In 2014, the anti-animal cruelty law draft was proposed and is being reviewed by the authorities. This is perhaps the most well-known proposal to date and is constantly being brought up. Then China proposed a series of wildlife protection measures, and just as September 1st, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs issued the guidelines for the administration of designated checkpoints for animal transports on roads, which will ensure more stringent regulations on the transportation of all animal species. There are also a number of national-level animal welfare regulations in China. We focus on the bold text. Our organization was actually consulted in the making of both regulations, the welfare criteria for slaughter and for disease control purposes. From the effective dates, you can see that it is really after COVID that things started to pick up quickly. Previously, it was mainly regarding laboratory animals. But in 2023, 2 regulations were published to focus on farmed animals. Now remember the map of China, the roosters, where only the wings and rear were pasture-based regions. We see pigs and farrowing crates without being able to interact with their young, laying hens in cages without space to flap their wings, meat chickens bred to be too heavy to walk, and sows in stalls without being able to turn around. These problems are common, especially in today's world, where productivity and quantity of production are prioritized over the welfare of individual animals. The rapid intensification has led to welfare issues across virtually all species. Although these situations are not unique to China, but we are seeing a clear shift for cages and net floors in poultry. Genetic selection for species and lack of enrichment is common among many species. For example, pigs don't have bedding or manipulable materials, and ducks are housed without water access. High stocking density is also common to maximize efficiency. In 2014, it was reported that 90% of laying hens are kept in cages in China, and other industry reports have even higher numbers for recent years. Fast-growing chickens occupy over 72% of the total production. Specifically, why is it so hard to improve pig welfare in China? The answer is diseases. Within 1 year of the first ASF outbreak in 2018, China suffered a direct financial loss of over 1 trillion RMB, which is about 128 billion euros. Therefore, the farmers that have merely survived the outbreak started to focus on the survival of their business and animals. Tighter biosecurity controls forbid them from providing basically any enrichment to completely ensure the hygiene of their farm. Although there is scientific evidence of alternatives, but the farmers just couldn't risk it. From the farm's perspective, one outbreak would kill their pigs and bankrupt them. Some go into the vicious cycle of antibiotic dependence and result in trade disruption and food safety risks. It is very hard to persuade the farms to risk their survival for higher welfare provisions. In the market, Chinese consumers base their purchases on meat quality and human health, so food safety comes first, then taste comes second. For example, there's only a very small margin of fake cage-free eggs, about 0.3 RMB, and this is barely 1/3 of the true margin of production. Interestingly, both products advertise as antibiotic-free and safe. Despite all of these challenges, we are seeing positive developments in many areas, especially after COVID. For example, Beijing, the capital, has a permanent venue of the annual World Conference on Farm Animal Welfare. And earlier this year, we published, to our knowledge, the first policy brief on farm animal welfare co-released by Yara, the Agriculture Authority. China's determination for genetic research and breed conservation could also have positive welfare implications. On the right, you see a Beijing Yu chicken, a Tibetan pig, a fairy living pig, and a silky feathered chicken. These are just examples of the 900 breeds from 33 species of farm animals that require higher welfare husbandry systems and enrichments in their guidance books. Pigs have better maternal behaviors and are fit for free farrowing. Slower growing breed chickens that are active and require a barn system or free range system. These genetic research farms could help, as through funding and collaboration, they could support local farms toward breed and system transitions. We have also collaborated with the CAAS, one of the leading institutions for agriculture, which established a new journal named Animal Research and One Health, with dedicated animal welfare contents. Research on the National Knowledge Database has also found that animal welfare-related research has been increasing, particularly 62% are focused on farm animals. Since 2014, we have established an award program for pigs, laying hens, and chickens in China to promote better welfare systems for producers. So far, over 433 million animals are set to benefit each year, and over 120 farms have made better welfare commitments. We also collaborate with domestic and international partners. Starting from 2014, the first animal welfare standard was released by our partner ICAO, and we've participated in many industry codes. It's been 11 years since I sat at the table for the first pig standard committee. There is so much positive change and so many welfare codes published since then. As previously mentioned, China truly emphasizes food safety, so the concept of One Health is truly helpful and is embedded in national health strategies. And China also frequently updates its AMI policy. In recent years, especially after COVID, there's evidence that consumer awareness for animal welfare is growing, such as for welfare-labeled pork. And the influence of global companies and export standards are also helpful. This is an ad of McDonald's new activity in China called CFC, Cage-Free Chicken. The Chinese translation is just as catchy. So you can see that both policy and business are building momentum toward better animal welfare in China. And here I conclude my presentation. This is a big topic, but I hope that this is the beginning of showcasing China's progress and dilemmas based on many years of frontline experience. I know there are different perspectives when it comes to animal welfare in China. Like many animal welfare scientists and activists, my interest in animal welfare extends beyond that of farm animal species. For the past 17 years, I've been involved in animal rescue. This is a picture of a kennel dog shelter that I co-own. I also have a blog that I've just started on WeChat about general animal welfare. I also advocate about cruelty-free cosmetics and cruelty-free research. Because I'm based in Beijing, unfortunately, I cannot take live questions, but please do get in touch, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. However, unfortunately, Yao is not able to join us today, so there won't be a live Q&A for this presentation. However, her contact information will be shared after today's event for those who might be interested in reaching out with some questions. I did see some in the chat, so I do encourage you to reach out. So our next speaker is Richie, the Director of Research at Bryant Research and Lead Data and AI Consultant at Greener by Default. Richie will share an evidence-based look at the links between farmed animals and global food security, highlighting flaws in prevailing narratives and opportunities for advocates to advance sustainable, plant-based alternatives.
Hi everyone, I'm Thomas Manandhar-Richardson. People call me Richie. I'm the Director of Research at Bryant Research, and today I'm going to be taking you through how we can achieve food security without factory farming. So I can't do this live because I'm not here, but maybe sound off in the chat if you've tried millet before. I've tried millet before, in fact, but I had to go to my local world food shop to do it. I bought some and I boiled it, and I had it similarly to how you might have couscous or rice. It was chewy, it was nutty, it was decent. If you've had Ethiopian food before, you will also have had millet before. That sour, bouncy pancake that all the food comes on, known as injera. Well, that's made from teff, which is a different kind of millet, but a millet nonetheless. So why did I go and buy some millet? Well, that's because I was writing a report on food security, and I wanted to see what all the hype was about with millet. Because, you see, the Indian government are a big fan of millet as a food security solution. In fact, they call millets Shri Anna, which means revered grains or ancient grains. And in fact, they declared 2023 the year of millet. And Bill and Melinda Gates, some of the biggest philanthropists in the world, are also very big fans of millets. They've funded lots of research and programs into increasing uptakes of millets worldwide. And when you look into it, it's easy to see why. Millets are known as nutri-cereals, nutritious cereals. They are higher, compared to rice, they are higher in fibre, calcium. They've been known to reduce blood pressure. They're generally healthier. But also, they are heat resistant when growing, right? They don't need as much irrigation as rice. And this makes them more climate resilient. In short, they're great for food security. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So, what is food security? Well, there's this complex definition here by the UN, but really it's just all about having access to enough food, to nutritious food, to affordable food, and to safe food. And if you do policy work in a high-income country, like in Europe or the States, you might actually be hearing more and more about food security. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to mainly focus on low and middle income countries, because although food security is an increasingly relevant conversation in high income countries, it's also a completely different conversation. It's different narratives, different stakeholders. It's actually a very different topic despite having the same name. And I only have 10 minutes for my talk. However, I did write this report on food security in the UK, and factory farming and alternative proteins with the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation. So you're welcome to email me and get a copy of this report if you're interested. Now, of course, the big meat corporations are pushing factory farming as an efficient way to feed the world and solve food security. But we all know that's not true. The standard response from our movement is what is called feed food competition. This is that animals are an inefficient way to make calories. It takes a lot of calories of animal feed to make very few calories of meat. In fact, globally, we feed about 1/3 to 40% of our crops to farm animals. And if we stopped using crops for feeding animals and simply fed those crops to humans, we could potentially feed an additional 4 billion people. That's like half the world's population. But as convincing as this argument is, I think it's a bit tired. And I think there are actually other arguments that we could be leaning on. So one pop quiz time. And again, I can't do this live, but how many people do you think don't get enough calories? Well, it's about 8.2% of the world's population. That's probably lower than you thought. I was certainly surprised. And in fact, this is a problem that is actually going our way. There was one academic paper reviewed 25 different academic simulation models that simulated the future food system, and they found that overall humanity is actually on track to being able to feed itself enough calories in 2050 without taking drastic measures, even if we keep feeding tons of crops to farm animals. But on the other hand, how many people don't get enough micronutrients? Well, that is 2.7 billion people, 34% of the world's population. And in some regions, it is much, much worse. And this one is not trending positively, unlike calories. There is very little progress on this, and unless we do something, we're going to hit 2050 with full bellies but empty food. So I want to focus the conversation on nutrients. And even more, I want to focus on the affordability of nutrients, because this is where plants can really shine. So we often hear the term animal foods are nutrient dense, like milk is nutrient dense, eggs are nutrient dense. But when we look into what this actually means, we find that it's a very Western-centric definition. When we say something is nutrient dense, we mean that it has a lot of nutrients for a low amount of food, or it has a lot of nutrients for very few calories, right? But this is a Western problem. We are trying to maximize our nutrients whilst minimizing the weight of food we eat, minimizing the calories we eat, right? We want to keep our calories down and our nutrition high. But this is not the case for many people around the world. They are less concerned with the total number of calories or the weight of food. What they want is affordable nutrition. They want to be able to meet their children's iron needs with as little money as possible. They want to be able to and what we find when we look at market data from around the world is that generally plants, particularly legumes, are actually a cheaper way to meet nutrient needs. So even though, for example, beef is an excellent source of iron and zinc, it is actually cheaper to meet your iron and zinc needs through buying beans than beef in most markets. And that's even taking into account the fact that the iron and zinc in beans is less bioavailable than in beef. Right, so 3 food security solutions I want to quickly take you through. One of them is old school and 2 are new school. So the old school one is what are called, ironically, future smart foods. Now these are neglected traditional crops that have been identified as climate resilient, rich in essential micronutrients. Many of these crops used to be staples around the world, but a lot of countries got rid of them over the past few decades to focus on growing enough white rice and wheat to combat hunger. And also, a lot of countries are now focused on growing cash crops to grow their economy. Future smart foods have been forgotten, but they're increasingly being rediscovered. They are great food security solutions because they're locally adapted. They're adapted to the countries where they're traditionally from. They've not been hugely popular thus far, mostly because they often require specialist processing machines, and that can make them hard to farm at scale. There's also a cultural element. Some people see these foods as heritage, forgotten traditional foods of their ancestors, right? But other people see them as outdated or poor people food. Right? The play here is that we should follow the tactic taken by the Indian government. You can recall that they branded millets as revered ancestral grains. Right? The potential is there. Next up, we've got biofortification. This is where you breed crops to be higher in micronutrients. And we're not talking just a little bit, we're talking like 50% higher micronutrients than even the best performing standard varietals. So for example, here we have iron beans, which can provide 80% of your daily iron needs. Vitamin A sweet potato, orange flesh sweet potato, this can provide up to 100% of your vitamin A needs, whereas traditional sweet potatoes have no vitamin A. Right? Now, these can be politically viable in some countries, but not others, right? Sometimes that involves genetic modification, other times it doesn't. In some countries, GMO crops are just a no-go. However, Harvest Plus, which is a big NGO that has been working on these, has deployed 293 varieties of biofortified crops over 100 million people in 30 countries, so they are certainly seeing some traction. Lastly, a bit of an idea. Should the World Bank fund alternative proteins as a food security fix? This is an idea I want to leave you with. The World Bank published their Recipe for a Livable Planet report recently, and they actually list alternative proteins like plant-based meats as second in a list of climate food fixes, right? Better than any form or any livestock solution, and just after reforestation. So the World Bank considers alternative proteins to be actually a really big climate fix. Also, alternative proteins are struggling for funding at the moment, and the World Bank is known for funding things that could potentially have great benefits, but for whatever reason don't attract enough conventional funding. And lastly, contrary to popular belief, alternative proteins are actually popular around the world. It's not just the European thing, right? There are many countries, particularly Southeast Asia, where people are interested in alternative proteins. So maybe the World Bank should be funding them. In conclusion, food security is less about calories and more about affordable nutrition. And secondly, in our food security conversations, we should be emphasising nutrient affordability. Third, we've got biofortified foods, we've got future smart foods as potential food security solutions to look at. And lastly, development banks should fund alternative proteins worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Richie. That was a wonderful presentation. So turning to some questions now. I don't think any have come into the chat yet, so I do encourage folks to put some questions in the chat if you have any. I do have some myself. So first, I wanted to know, Richie, based on the insights of your research, what do you think are the most important next steps for advocates when it comes to global food security work?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think the first thing is actually just to start talking about food security as an issue, as something that plant-based can solve, and as something that factory farming is not a solution for. So something we see, for example, in the UK, we see industrial livestock using food security as an excuse. Like, we are shoring up the country's food security, and it's just not true, right? I think we need to be like making these arguments, pushing back on them. So getting clued up on these arguments and then just making them in public, I think is good. This is the kind of thing you can also engage your local policymakers for, right? So some of us email our members of parliament, our state representatives about issues, and food security arguments can often be one that they will listen to more than other arguments. So lots of policymakers speak the language of food security, and if we want to sway them, then we need to be speaking their language too. And lastly, on the kind of thing of when it comes to, for example, these future smart foods, if you are in a country where these initiatives are going on, or you may be able to contribute to this in the sense of we want to build lots of countries. We can build a food culture where going more plant-based can just be about rediscovering the food of your grandparents and promoting foods that were beloved in your country for generations until we just decided to get rid of them and just farm rice. So one thing you can do is, if you don't already, is just rediscover your culinary history, the plants from your generations gone by, and show your friends, host dinner parties. give millet to everyone who will take it, that kind of thing.
Thank you so much. I love that. So we do have a question that's come in from Tanae. Do you have any suggestions when it comes to kind of encouraging large institutions such as the World Bank to fund things like alternative protein?
Yeah, well, I mean, apart from getting a job at the World Bank, that would be. I mean, to be fair, this is if you are considering a career path and you want to help animals, but you think you actually might be the kind of person who could get a job at the World Bank, like it is better to go work there and then try and make change for animals than it is maybe to work in the movement. So, but yeah, when it comes to like kind of lobbying them, they do sometimes respond to public pressure. So, for example, Big Millet, yeah, you could go work for Big Millet. The, but they do respond to public pressure. So, for example, there are some organisations, particularly. So, one I want to shout out is Synergia Animal. They work in Southeast Asia and Latin America, and they, along with some other organisations, they do things like they lobby these development banks, particularly to not fund factory farming, but they have got people, they have had these institutions listen to them. So these campaigns can work. So I wonder if there is, yeah, I wonder if there's a route there. I guess there'd also be a case where if you want to, if you're in one of these countries and you know of, say, an upcoming plant-based brand that's like kind of struggling to scale, then seeing if you can promote that brand, like see if you can do any campaign to get that brand onto the radar of some of these development banks, as it would be as an investment in local food security. Like anything you can do there that would be really beneficial too.
Thank you so much. Yeah, good old public pressure, right? So I don't see any other questions. We still have a little bit more time, so I have another one. You did mention how climate resistance within crops is really important for food security. And I was just curious, are there any environmental drawbacks to biofortification? I was interested in this concept and hadn't really heard of it prior to your presentation. So if you could speak more to the kind of environmental aspects of it.
Yeah, so it sometimes does come with loss of yields, but not as much as you'd think. And it's more the case that it can take a bit longer to develop a varietal that kind of ticks all of the boxes. It's not often the case that there are like fundamental trade-offs. And yeah, there's that. So there are cases where you can get, you can improve yields whilst improving micronutrients, or you can improve yields whilst also encouraging climate resistance. And to some extent, improving climate resistance does improve yield. It just depends when you measure yield, right? Like if you measure the final product. So yeah, you can. With these kinds of things, you can often have multiple traits at once. It can be a fine balancing act, but you can.
Thank you. So another question did come in. We have one more minute. So Deepti had asked if there are any specific organizations or accounts that you recommend folks to follow to stay updated on the topic of future smart foods and food security in general.
Yeah, no, so unfortunately, I don't have really great ones to follow here because it's I kind of see it as a conversation within that has barely really emerged in our movement, and so it's I mean you can follow Bryant Research, I guess, but but in terms of that, you may want to follow, for example, some of the UN's Food and Agriculture organization does, they have kind of scattered blogs and initiatives and things. So it may be worth looking into some of those. And yeah, these big kind of development banks and multilateral institutions, occasionally they will have something. They will do something weird, like they'll do a podcast on a particular region for a couple of months. So kind of keeping an eye out for those kinds of things. But in terms of like who consistently to follow, and unfortunately, I don't have too many great recommendations. Unfortunately, if anyone in the audience does, then put it in the chat. because I'd like to hear too.
That's a wonderful suggestion. Thank you. So that looks like all the time we have. If you want to continue with the discussion, please wait until after the session, where you can go into a breakout room with all of the speakers from this session. So our next speaker is Yara Moussa. Yara is a researcher and program manager with over a decade of experience in social justice, conservation, and sustainability across the MENA region and the UK. She will share insights from her research on the emerging animal advocacy movement in Egypt, highlighting key challenges, opportunities, and recommendations for sustainable growth.
Hi everyone, my name is Yara and I am a research specialist working at the intersection of social development and conservation, and one of the authors that contributed to the research being presented today, titled The Landscape of Animal Advocacy in Egypt: Insights into Stray Wildlife and Farmed Animal Rights. This research was commissioned and conducted by Ethical Seafood Research. ESR is an organization that focuses on capacity building research and policy change with the aim of improving the lives of aquatic animals in Africa and globally, and their current projects are in Egypt, Zanzibar, and Kenya. Our research that we're presenting today examines the wider landscape of animal advocacy in Egypt, a nascent and growing field. We've observed the current lack of data on the topic, and so our research hopes to address this critical knowledge gap. We also synthesize data and research findings focusing on stray, wild, and farmed animals, and analyze current practices and trends in each of these subgroups. We try to highlight the challenges and opportunities facing the growth of the animal advocacy movement through these lenses. Our findings also highlight priority areas for impactful advocacy efforts, and we propose recommendations, which we will show at the end of the presentation, for the growth of the movement, ensuring it's integrated into local and social practices. So the methodology we used entailed conducting a desk-based literature search to find animal advocacy-related reports, publications, and organizations that are active in Egypt. We also conducted interviews with organizations working with stray animals, working animals, and wild animals to better understand the current state of their work in the field and to get a better understanding of the challenges that they face. It's important to note that this sample is unlikely to represent the entire animal advocacy organizations that work in Egypt, although they do offer very valuable insights into common experiences and trends. Information about the Egyptian economy might be helpful here. Egypt is one of Africa's largest economies and most densely populated countries, with a human population that is expected to surpass 160 million by 2050. So the skyrocketing rate of urbanization, coupled by a persistent demand for food and shelter and fuel, in addition to rapidly increasing external debt and vulnerability to global market fluctuations, the economy faces mounting pressures on its resources. A major geographical feature of the region is the Nile Delta and the Nile River. The Nile provides around 97% of the country's freshwater needs, while the Delta accounts for over 50% of its economic activity, primarily through agricultural work. Agriculture and agribusinesses are the country's largest employers, employing between a quarter and a third of the population. As for the types of animals in Egypt, they fall into various categories or uses, and those are farmed animals, working animals, stray animals, and wild animals. Animals used in entertainment and for scientific research are unfortunately also prevalent, yet none of the organizations we interviewed worked with these types of animals directly, and so we'll be focusing on those during our discussion today. So taking a quick look at farmed animals, those include cattle, sheep, and poultry. As you can see from this graph, poultry production has actually seen a significant increase in the last few years, while challenges continue to face cattle and sheep production, and this is mainly due to increased feed costs, which are particularly burdensome for small and medium-sized farms that make up about 70% of animal husbandries in the country. Water scarcity that we've discussed before in the Nile region also poses challenges to the sheep and cattle sectors. The government does hope to expand industrialized agriculture with particular focus on poultry. And there are proposals to increase chicken production numbers up to 2 billion by 2030 and to double the number of eggs produced in that same time frame. So aquatic farmed animals tell a bit of a different story. Total fish production currently stands at around 2 million tons, which for those not so familiar with fisheries and aquaculture is a very significant volume. It's a number that's projected to continue to grow, as you can see in the figure here on the left. Egypt is currently the top producer of fish in Africa and the 6th largest producer on a global scale. It's also the 3rd largest producer of Nile tilapia globally. So the vast majority of that production comes from aquaculture, which you can see as the red line for fisheries here is relatively small, and most of that production is the farming of Nile tilapia. Most of the aquaculture production is centered around the Nile Delta, which you can see in the image on the top right, and most of that production is carried out in ponds, which you can see as an example of in the image below on the right. And although this sector has seen significant growth, climate change-induced water scarcity, again, is projected to have a substantial negative impact on water levels and on Egypt's agri-food production. So Egypt has an estimated 1.7 million working animals, including donkeys, mules, and horses, and they work in transportation and in tourism, often under grueling conditions. As for stray animals, recent estimates say that there are anywhere from 15 to 50 million stray dogs, with many more stray cats. There is a bit of a stigma towards the stray population in Egypt, although we've seen this trend change a little bit over the last few years. Egypt is also home to a diversity of wild animals, including 13,000 fish species, over 470 bird species, and over 200 species of mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. Unfortunately, rescue operations are not always easy to conduct, and they require a high level of coordination between a number of different bodies, which is not always easy to guarantee or secure. Our research and findings show that the majority of the animal advocacy groups operating in Egypt actually work with the stray animal population. This is followed by working animals and then followed by wild animals. So here we'll discuss quickly some of our key findings. Data from our interviews and discussions with those working in the field point to the lack of funding, actually, as the #1 challenge for many of the participants. Some participants expressed how difficult it is to raise funds due to the low cultural receptivity towards animal advocacy. Also, when grants are available, they're not always helpful for the day-to-day running costs, as they tend to be structured around a one-off project. So as one participant put it, "I feed my dogs with £500,000 Egyptian pounds. This is where I need the money, so I don't need money for specific projects." Our data also highlighted the fact that the international funding ecosystem often fails to align with local needs, as donor funding mechanisms may not provide the agility and flexibility that local organizations require for daily necessities. Legislative efforts were also another key finding. Several advocacy organizations have proposed new legislation aimed at improving animal welfare, yet they draft laws that are often refused. One participant spoke of how politicians are reluctant to prioritize new animal welfare laws due to the overwhelming economic and social concerns that the country faces, and so it's currently seen as less of a priority. And this is seen and is reflected by the minimal legislative support observed to date. Finally, social and cultural initiatives and educational initiatives have been highlighted as particularly promising in both our interviews and our desk-based research, and this is likely closely related to the importance of interpersonal interactions and how it brings out the localized knowledge that actually exists locally. During our research, we also found that low cultural receptivity to animal welfare is particularly apparent with farmed animals, where most people only focus on sort of the physical needs of animals with little regard to their psychological well-being. However, Animal Advocacy Africa has produced a report arguing for farmed animals to be a top priority for advocacy efforts within the African continent, and we find that this applies to Egypt in many ways. So, first of all, We found that the rising costs of feed and production, combined with the increased costs that the consumers have to bear, have actually caused a recent lull in the expansion of industrialized agriculture. It is therefore a potentially ideal time to consider plant-based alternatives and to establish benchmarks for animal welfare before the industry experiences exponential growth. We also found that concern for infectious diseases after COVID and the rise of avian influenza make this an opportune time to draw the focus on the impacts of industrialized agriculture on human health and sort of bring out the One Health approach more strongly. There's also an opportunity to scale institutional outreach by supporting farmer networks. This could work well in Egypt, considering the high numbers of small-scale farms in the country. And finally, the growing popularity of animal welfare, especially for stray animals, as mentioned, could potentially help the growth of the animal welfare movement also for farmed animals. Finally, we thought it would be good to sort of present top-line recommendations from our research. Based on our research, we found that supporting small-scale farmers could promote high animal welfare practices and foster a more ethical and sustainable farming model. Advocating for funding shifts to move away from rigid project-based models towards ones that promote sustainable and adaptable funding solutions that are tailored to the unique challenges faced by animal advocates, particularly shelters and other wildlife rescue organizations. We also found that promoting plant-based alternatives will help support human well-being and also contribute to improving farmed animal welfare by reducing reliance on animal agriculture. Institutional capacity building by strengthening the understanding of the One Health framework, which emphasizes the interconnectedness of animal, human health, and the environment. And focusing on youth-centered educational campaigns, which are designed and implemented for children and young people, empowering them with the skills to advocate for animal welfare. We've noticed that children and younger generations have more of an understanding of animal welfare and receptivity to it. Finally, integrating animal welfare into larger environmental advocacy projects rather than treating them as separate initiatives, which could open up more diverse funding opportunities, essential for building the animal advocacy space. Finally, we find that by highlighting the connections between the animal welfare movement and the various crises of climate, biodiversity, and health, advocates may be able to push for policies that promote better welfare through a wider environmental lens. This is the end of our presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to having a discussion and hearing all your questions and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Yara. That was wonderful. So we do have 1 minute for some questions. We do have one from Olga. So Yara, would you please be able to speak to or elaborate more on how cultural and social contexts impact the advocacy movement in Egypt?
Yeah, thanks everyone, and thanks for this question. I think it's a really good one. I think the social and cultural aspect kind of actually defines the trajectory at which certain movements, especially new movements, can start to propel forward. So I think it's really important to focus on this particular aspect. When we mentioned the social and cultural aspect, we were talking about several things really, and I think one point that I kind of want to pull out from some of our findings is the role of religious discourse. So Egypt is a majority Muslim country, and there are some sort of rules and ways in which where religious discourse actually asks for the humane treatment of animals. A lot of these sorts of religious principles and teachings kind of get lost, in our day-to-day lives. And so one of the things that we thought would be helpful actually is to try and reposition religious discourse and kind of bring it to the fore a little bit, because people do have a high propensity to listen to, accept, and sort of tune in to religious teachings that would actually help in sort of solidifying some of these animal welfare concepts. So in trying to work essentially with the local culture and the social context to help move this discussion a bit more forward, and make sure that it's done in a positive manner, highlighting some of the problems with dealing with animals only as a source of food, for example, rather than sentient beings, which is something that is, heralded by religious teachings and so on. I think another point is the how we integrate and interact with younger generations. So, as I mentioned in the presentation, we've seen sort of an uptick in how people are reacting to animal welfare issues more widely. So specifically, we're talking about stray animals, working animals, sort of the animals that people see on a day-to-day basis on the street every day, and the extent to which a lot of new groups, especially younger people, are sympathizing with the cause of animal welfare through the lens of wild animals and stray animals and working animals. And so what we're advocating for here is to continue integrating younger people into these discussions, because the sensibility to animal welfare is increasing, and therefore the sensibility towards increasing farmed animal welfare is therefore there's a high opportunity for this conversation to be taken forward as well. So it's important to really look at overall the cultural context. It makes sense to also look at the economic context, just to make sure that we're not asking people to do things that they're unable to do or that are irrelevant to them. So if half the population, for example, isn't able to afford meat, then it wouldn't really, it would kind of not make a lot of sense to direct that message to that part of the population. So we're talking about, certain groups that are engaged, certain institutions like educational and religious institutions that can really help engage younger people specifically.
Thank you so much, Yara. So that is time for this session. But for continued discussions on any of these topics, please note the link in the chat that's inviting you to the breakout room for neglected regions. So this is going to be held in a Google meeting. The previous 3 speakers and Dr. Faraz will all be there. So if you have a question, I do see one that entered the chat as you were speaking, Yara, but you didn't get a chance to answer it. Or if anybody else has other questions, please take the opportunity to visit the breakout room. So thank you all so much. This was a fantastic first session. And our next session is on fish and aquaculture. That will start at 1:25 Eastern Time. We'll see you then.